They say blood runs thicker than water, but what happens when that blood turns toxic? What happens when the person who should welcome you into their family instead plots your demise? My name is Sophia, and I'm about to tell you how I discovered my mother-in-law wasn't just trying to make my life difficult. She was literally trying to end it. The recording I'm about to share with you saved my life, exposed a monster, and changed everything I thought I knew about the woman who raised the man I loved. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first time I met Margaret Whitfield, I should have trusted my instincts. There was something about the way her smile never quite reached her cold gray eyes, something about how her perfectly manicured fingers seemed to grip her teacup just a little too tightly when she looked at me. But I was so desperately in love with her son David that I convinced myself I was imagining things. Love has a way of making us blind to red flags that are practically screaming in our faces. David had warned me that his mother was particular about the women he dated. What he failed to mention was that Margaret Whitfield was a woman who had spent 34 years believing that no woman would ever be worthy of her precious son. She had already driven away 3 previous girlfriends with her calculated cruelty, each one retreating from David's life rather than endure Margaret's psychological warfare. I wasn't going to be the fourth. Our first meeting took place at their family estate in Milbert, a sprawling Victorian mansion that had been in the Whitfield family for 4 generations. The house itself was beautiful but cold, filled with antiques and family portraits that seemed to watch your every move with disapproving eyes. Margaret had insisted on hosting Sunday dinner to properly meet the woman her son had been seeing for 8 months. I spent hours getting ready that morning, carefully selecting a conservative navy dress that I hoped would strike the right balance between respectful and stylish. David had coached me on topics to avoid and warned me about his mother's tendency to ask probing personal questions, but nothing could have prepared me for the Arctic reception I received. Margaret answered the door herself, despite having a full staff of household help. She was an imposing woman in her late 50s, with silver hair pulled back into a severe chignon and the kind of posture that spoke of expensive finishing school training. Her outfit was pristine, a cream-colored silk blouse tucked into perfectly pressed gray slacks with a string of pearls that probably cost more than my car. "You must be Sophia," she said, her voice carrying the refined accent of old money. Her eyes traveled from my shoes to my face in a slow, deliberate assessment that made me feel like livestock being evaluated at auction. How? The word quaint was delivered with such precise disdain that it might as well have been profanity. I forced a smile and extended my hand, which she shook briefly with the tips of her fingers, as if afraid my middle-class origins might be contagious. "Mrs. Whitfield, it's such a pleasure to finally meet you. David speaks of you constantly." "I'm sure he does," she replied, turning to lead me into the house. "David has always been rather sentimental about family bonds, sometimes to a fault." The dining room was a monument to understated elegance, with a mahogany table that could easily seat 12 people. Crystal glasses caught the light from an elaborate chandelier, and the china pattern was so delicate it looked like it might shatter if you breathed on it too hard. I was seated directly across from Margaret, a strategic placement that ensured I would be under her direct scrutiny for the entire meal. David arrived 20 minutes later, apologizing profusely for being delayed by work. He kissed his mother's cheek before taking his seat at the head of the table, and I noticed how Margaret's entire demeanor softened when her son was present. The transformation was remarkable. The Ice Queen became a doting mother, hanging on his every word and laughing at jokes that weren't particularly funny. "Darling, you work far too hard," Margaret cooed, reaching over to straighten David's tie. "A man in your position needs to take better care of himself. You're looking thin." David laughed and caught my eye with an apologetic smile. "Mother, I'm fine. Sophia's actually been cooking for me lately, and she's an amazing chef." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Margaret's gaze shifted to me with laser-like intensity, and I felt my stomach clench with anxiety. "How thoughtful," she said. her tone suggesting it was anything but. I wasn't aware that David needed someone to take care of his nutritional needs. He's managed quite well on his own for 32 years. I enjoy cooking, I replied carefully. It's relaxing for me after long days at the hospital. Ah, yes, you're a nurse, aren't you? Margaret's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Such a service-oriented profession. How noble of you to dedicate yourself to caring for others. The way she said service-oriented made it sound like something slightly shameful, as if my career choice revealed some fundamental character flaw. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger, but I kept my voice level. I find it very fulfilling. There's something special about being able to help people during their most vulnerable moments. I'm sure there is, Margaret agreed, cutting into her prime rib with surgical precision. Of course, some people are naturally drawn to positions of servitude, while others are meant for leadership roles. It's all about knowing one's place in the world. David cleared his throat uncomfortably. Mother, Sophia is actually the head of pediatric intensive care at Metropolitan General. She manages a team of 40 nurses and has implemented several programs that have significantly reduced patient mortality rates. How impressive, Margaret said, though her tone suggested she was anything but impressed. Still, at the end of the day, it's about following doctors' orders, isn't it? Taking direction from those with more extensive education and training. I felt something snap inside me, but before I could respond, Margaret had already moved on to her next line of attack. Tell me, dear, what do your parents do for work? This was the question I had been dreading. David squeezed my hand under the table, offering what support he could, but we both knew this was going to be uncomfortable. My father is a mechanic, I said, lifting my chin slightly in defiance. He owns his own shop in Queens. My mother is a teacher at the local elementary school. How practical, Margaret mused, as if she were discussing something mildly distasteful. Blue-collar families often instill strong work ethics in their children. I suppose that explains your career choice. The condescension was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. David looked mortified, but he seemed frozen, unable or unwilling to challenge his mother directly. I realized in that moment that this was a test, not just of my ability to handle Margaret's hostility, but of whether David would stand up for me when it mattered. My parents taught me the value of hard work and integrity, I said, meeting Margaret's gaze directly. They also taught me that a person's worth isn't measured by their bank account or their family name, but by their character and how they treat others. Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly, and for a moment, I thought I saw something like approval flicker across her face. Then the mask slipped back into place, and she was once again the Ice Queen. How refreshingly idealistic, she said. Youth often comes with such charming naivety about how the world actually works. The rest of the dinner passed in relative silence, with Margaret making occasional small talk about David's work and upcoming social obligations. I noticed that she had a habit of discussing plans that clearly didn't include me, as if I were invisible or temporary, which, in her mind, I probably was. When coffee was served in delicate porcelain cups that looked like they belonged in a museum, Margaret finally addressed me directly again. Sophia, I hope you'll forgive my directness, but I feel it's important to be honest about expectations within our family. Her voice was smooth as silk, but there was steel underneath. The Whitfield name carries significant social responsibility. We move in certain circles, maintain certain standards, and uphold certain traditions that have been in place for generations. I felt my pulse quicken, sensing that this was leading somewhere unpleasant. David's future wife will need to understand and embrace these obligations, Margaret continued, stirring her coffee with slow, deliberate movements. She'll be expected to host charity galas, serve on various boards, and represent our family at important social functions. It's a role that requires particular qualifications. The implication was crystal clear. I lacked those qualifications. I was too common, too rough around the edges, too everything that Margaret Whitfield despised about the changing world around her. I think Sophia would be wonderful at all of those things, David said, finally finding his voice. She's intelligent, compassionate, and she has a natural ability to connect with people from all walks of life. Margaret's smile was patronizing. Of course you think so, darling. Love has a way of clouding our judgment about what's truly suitable. That word, suitable, hit me like a physical blow. I had spent my entire adult life working to better myself, to rise above the circumstances of my birth and create something meaningful with my life. But to this woman, none of that mattered. I would never be suitable because I didn't have the right pedigree, the right connections, the right background. I excused myself to use the restroom, needing a moment to collect myself before I said something I might regret. The powder room was decorated with more family portraits, generations of Whitfields staring down at me with the same cold, judgmental eyes I had been subjected to all evening. When I returned to the dining room, I found Margaret and David in quiet conversation that ceased the moment I appeared. David's face was flushed, and Margaret looked smugly satisfied, like a cat who had just caught a particularly elusive mouse. The drive home was tense and silent. David's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, and I could see the muscle in his jaw working as he struggled with whatever thoughts were racing through his mind. "Your mother hates me," I said finally, breaking the uncomfortable silence. David sighed heavily. "She doesn't hate you, Sophia. She's just protective." "She's been burned before by women who were only interested in the family money. Is that what you think I am?" The question came out sharper than I intended. "No, of course not." David reached over and took my hand. "I know you're nothing like that, but my mother has her own way of looking at things, and it takes time for her to warm up to new people." "Warm up?" I couldn't help but laugh, though there was no humor in it. "David, she basically told me I'm not good enough for you. She questioned my career, my family background, my very existence in your life." "She didn't mean it that way," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yes, she did," I replied quietly. "And the scary part is, I don't think you disagreed with her." David was quiet for the rest of the drive, which told me everything I needed to know. The man I loved was torn between his feelings for me and his loyalty to his mother, and I wasn't sure which side would ultimately win. That night, lying in my small apartment that suddenly felt even smaller after seeing the grandeur of the Whitfield estate, I made a decision. I wouldn't let Margaret Whitfield drive me away without a fight. I had worked too hard and come too far to let some snobbish society matron decide my future for me. But I had no idea just how far Margaret was willing to go to remove me from her son's life. I thought I was dealing with garden-variety classism and snobbery. I didn't realize I was up against something much more dangerous, something that would eventually threaten not just my relationship with David, but my very life. The weeks following that disastrous dinner were marked by a series of small but deliberate acts of sabotage. David would mention plans for us to attend various social functions, only to call later and explain that his mother had forgotten to add me to the guest list. Invitations to family gatherings would arrive addressed only to David, with no mention of a plus one. When I did manage to attend events, I would find myself seated at tables with the least desirable guests, while David was positioned prominently next to his mother. Margaret's tactics were subtle but effective. She never did anything that could be called outright rude. She was far too sophisticated for such obvious maneuvers. Instead, she deployed a death-by-a-thousand-cut strategy, each small slight designed to make me feel unwelcome and out of place. At a charity auction for the children's hospital where I worked, Margaret made a point of introducing me to everyone as David's friend from work. When I corrected her to explain that we had been dating for over a year, she smiled sweetly and said, "Oh, how presumptuous of me to assume it was serious." During a family birthday celebration for David's father, Margaret presented a slideshow of family memories that somehow managed to include every woman David had ever dated except me. When David pointed out the omission, she feigned surprise and claimed she simply hadn't received any photos of us together, despite the fact that David had sent her several just weeks earlier. The psychological warfare was exhausting, but I was determined not to give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. I continued to attend every event I was invited to, maintained my composure in the face of her passive-aggressive attacks, and tried to focus on building a genuine relationship with David's father, who seemed to genuinely like me despite his wife's obvious disapproval. David, for his part, seemed oblivious to much of his mother's behavior. When I tried to discuss specific incidents with him, he would minimize them or suggest that I was being oversensitive. It became clear that Margaret had perfected her tactics over years of practice. She knew exactly how to undermine me without crossing lines that would force David to choose sides. But I began to notice other things that troubled me more deeply. Margaret had an unusual level of control over David's life for a 32-year-old man. She had keys to his apartment and would let herself in to tidy up or drop off home-cooked meals. She scheduled his social calendar without consulting him, booking him for events and obligations that conveniently conflicted with our plans. Most disturbing of all, she had managed his finances since college, handling his investments and maintaining control over trust funds that should have been his to manage. The more I learned about their relationship, the more I realized that David wasn't just a devoted son. He was a grown man who had never been allowed to fully separate from his mother. Margaret had spent 30 decades ensuring that no other woman could compete with her position as the primary female influence in her son's life. This understanding changed my perspective on our situation. I wasn't just fighting for David's love. I was challenging a power structure that Margaret had carefully constructed over decades. She didn't just dislike me because of my background. She saw me as an existential threat to her control over her son. The realization should have been empowering, but instead it filled me with a deep sense of unease. If Margaret was willing to go to such elaborate lengths to maintain control over David's life, what else might she be willing to do to eliminate threats to that control? I started paying closer attention to the women who had come before me, the 3 previous girlfriends who had mysteriously disappeared from David's life. When I casually asked David about them, his responses were vague and uncomfortable. All he would say was that his mother had helped him see that those relationships weren't compatible with his long-term goals. Curious, I did some digging on social media and managed to track down 2 of David's former girlfriends. The first, a lawyer named Jennifer, had moved to Seattle shortly after their breakup and refused to discuss her relationship with David beyond saying that his mother made it impossible. The second, a marketing executive named Amy, was more forthcoming. "Run," Amy told me during a phone conversation that chilled me to the bone. I'm not exaggerating when I say that woman is dangerous. She's not just controlling, she's vindictive and she's smart. Whatever you think you're dealing with, it's worse than you realize. When I pressed for details, Amy's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Things started happening to me after I began getting serious with David. My car tires were slashed twice in 1 month. Someone broke into my apartment but didn't steal anything, just went through my personal belongings and left everything slightly out of place. I started getting strange phone calls in the middle of the night, heavy breathing and then click. My boss received an anonymous tip that I was embezzling money, which led to a humiliating investigation that nearly cost me my job. My blood ran cold.
Did you report any of this to the police? With what proof? Amy's laugh was bitter. Margaret Whitfield is a pillar of the community. She serves on half a dozen charitable boards and has connections throughout the city. Meanwhile, I'm just some woman claiming that my boyfriend's mother is stalking me. Who do you think they would have believed? What finally made you leave? There was a long pause before Amy answered. I was walking home from work one evening, and a car jumped the curb and nearly hit me. The driver never stopped, but I got a glimpse of the license plate. When I ran the numbers through a friend who works at the DMV, it came back registered to a car rental company. The rental was paid for with cash by someone giving the name Margaret Smith. My hands were shaking as I ended the call. Margaret Smith, a convenient alias for Margaret Whitfield. The implications were terrifying, but they also explained something that had been nagging at me for weeks. I had been experiencing my own series of accidents lately, though I had attributed them to stress and coincidence. A ladder had collapsed while I was changing a light bulb in my apartment, sending me tumbling to the floor with a twisted ankle and several bruises. The brakes on my car had mysteriously failed while I was driving to work, forcing me to use the emergency brake to avoid rear-ending another vehicle. A heavy potted plant had somehow fallen from my fire escape, missing my head by inches as I returned home from a late shift. At the time, each incident had seemed like random bad luck, but now, viewed through the lens of Amy's experience, they took on a much more sinister cast. Was it possible that Margaret was already escalating her campaign against me? I tried to discuss my concerns with David, but his reaction was exactly what I had feared. He accused me of being paranoid and suggested that I was letting stress from work affect my judgment. When I mentioned my conversation with Amy, he became angry and accused me of digging into his past like some kind of stalker. These women left because they couldn't handle the expectations that come with being part of our family, David said, his voice taking on a cold tone I had never heard before. Maybe you should ask yourself if you're really ready for this kind of commitment, because it's starting to seem like you're looking for excuses to bail. The conversation ended with David storming out of my apartment, leaving me alone with my fears and a growing certainty that I was in more danger than I had realized. If Margaret was willing to resort to physical intimidation and potential violence to remove obstacles from her son's life, what would she do when she realized that I had no intention of giving up without a fight? That night, I made a decision that would change everything. If Margaret Whitfield wanted to play games, I would learn to play them better than she did. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was up against and gather evidence that even David couldn't dismiss. I started by upgrading my home security system and installing cameras in strategic locations around my apartment. I began documenting every strange occurrence, no matter how minor, and started carrying a small digital recorder with me everywhere I went. If Margaret was planning something more serious than vandalism and intimidation, I wanted to be ready. What I wasn't prepared for was just how quickly things would escalate, or how far Margaret was willing to go to eliminate what she saw as a threat to her carefully constructed world. The woman I thought I was dealing with, a snobbish society matron with control issues, was about to reveal herself as something much more dangerous. The breaking point came 3 months later, on a crisp October evening that started like any other, but ended with me fearing for my life and finally understanding the true depths of Margaret Whitfield's malice. What I would discover that night would force me to question everything I thought I knew about the woman who had raised the man I loved, and it would set in motion a chain of events that would either destroy me or finally free David from his mother's toxic grip. I had no way of knowing that within hours, I would be hiding in a closet with my phone recording a conversation that would expose Margaret Whitfield as not just a manipulative mother-in-law, but as someone willing to commit murder to maintain control over her son's life. The phone call came at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, jolting me from the first peaceful sleep I'd had in weeks. David's voice was strained and panicked as he explained that his father had suffered a heart attack and was being rushed to Presbyterian Hospital. Without hesitation, I threw on clothes and drove through the empty city streets, my mind racing with worry for a man who had become one of the few bright spots in my increasingly complicated relationship with the Whitfield family. Charles Whitfield had always treated me with genuine warmth, a stark contrast to his wife's calculated coldness. During family gatherings, he would seek me out for conversations about my work at the hospital, showing authentic interest in the medical field and praising my dedication to patient care. He had a way of making me feel valued and respected that his wife seemed incapable of, and I had grown genuinely fond of the quiet, dignified man who had spent 40 years married to Margaret's particular brand of toxicity. The cardiac intensive care unit at Presbyterian was familiar territory for me, having worked in similar environments throughout my nursing career. I found David pacing the waiting room, his usually perfect hair disheveled and his expensive suit wrinkled from hours of anxious fidgeting. Margaret sat ramrod straight in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs, her face a mask of composed concern that somehow managed to look perfectly put together even at 3 in the morning. "How is he?" I asked, immediately moving to David's side and taking his trembling hand in mine. "Stable for now," David replied, his voice thick with emotion. "They've got him hooked up to every machine in the hospital, but the doctors say the next 48 hours will be critical." Margaret's eyes tracked my movements as I settled into the chair beside David, offering what comfort I could. I noticed how her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when David leaned into me, seeking the support that any normal mother would have provided. Instead of offering her son emotional comfort during one of the most frightening moments of his life, Margaret seemed more concerned with cataloging every interaction between David and me, as if she were gathering intelligence for some future battle. The hours that followed established a pattern that would define the next week of our lives. David split his time between his father's bedside and the waiting room, emotionally exhausted and desperately in need of support. I did everything I could to be there for him, bringing him food he barely touched, coordinating with the medical team using my professional connections, and simply holding his hand when the weight of watching his father fight for life became too much to bear. Margaret, meanwhile, seemed to view the entire crisis as an opportunity to reassert her dominance over David's attention and decision-making. She scheduled meetings with doctors without consulting David, made decisions about Charles's care without input from anyone else, and somehow managed to position herself as the sole guardian of information about his condition. What disturbed me most was how Margaret seemed to thrive in the crisis atmosphere. While David grew increasingly haggard and emotional, she appeared energized by the chaos, more animated than I had ever seen her. She held court in the waiting room like some kind of tragic queen, accepting condolences and managing the steady stream of visitors with practiced efficiency. It was as if Charles's brush with death had somehow validated her importance and given her a starring role in a drama she was determined to direct.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
On the third day, when Charles had stabilized enough to have brief conversations, Margaret made it clear that visiting hours would be strictly limited and carefully controlled. Family only, she announced, with meaningful glances in my direction that left no doubt about my exclusion from that category. When David protested that I was practically family after nearly 2 years together, Margaret's smile was razor sharp. Practically isn't actually, darling. Charles needs rest, and too many visitors will only tax his strength. I'm sure Sophia understands the importance of putting Charles's needs first. The dismissal was delivered with such practiced authority that even David seemed unable to argue. I found myself relegated to the waiting room while Margaret and David spent hours at Charles's bedside, emerging only to provide carefully edited updates on his progress. It was during one of these long waiting periods that I began to overhear conversations that would change my understanding of the Whitfield family dynamics forever. Margaret had a habit of conducting phone calls in the hallway outside the ICU, her voice carrying further than she realized in the sterile hospital corridors. Initially, her conversations seemed routine: updates to family friends, coordination with household staff, discussions with Charles's business partners about postponing meetings and obligations. But gradually, I began to notice a different tone creeping into certain calls, a calculating quality that made me pay closer attention. Yes, it's been a tremendous strain on David, I heard her say during a call to someone she addressed as Eleanor. He's completely overwhelmed, barely able to think straight. This has really shown me how much he needs family support during difficult times. There was a pause as the other person responded, then Margaret continued with something that made my blood run cold. Well, that's exactly what I mean. He's been relying far too heavily on outsiders for emotional support instead of turning to family where he belongs. Sometimes it takes a crisis like this to help people see what's really important, what relationships actually matter when everything else falls away. The implications of her words settled in my stomach like lead. Margaret wasn't just using her husband's heart attack as an opportunity to limit my access to David. She was actively using the crisis to drive a wedge between us, to demonstrate that I was an outsider who couldn't provide the kind of support that family could offer. Over the following days, I began to see the full scope of Margaret's manipulation. She scheduled important meetings with doctors during times when she knew I would be at work, ensuring that I missed crucial conversations about Charles's treatment and prognosis. She arranged for David to stay at the family estate during his father's hospitalization, claiming he needed to be closer to the hospital, but actually ensuring that he would be under her direct supervision and influence during his most vulnerable emotional state. Most insidiously, she began planting seeds of doubt about my commitment to David and our relationship. I overheard her telling David that she was concerned about how my work schedule was preventing me from being there when he needed me most. She wondered aloud whether someone who truly loved him would be so quick to prioritize career obligations over family emergencies. She suggested that perhaps this crisis was revealing fundamental incompatibilities between us that David had been too infatuated to see clearly. David, exhausted and emotionally raw from days of watching his father hover between life and death, began to internalize his mother's subtle criticism. I could see the doubt creeping into his eyes when I had to leave for work or when hospital policies prevented me from being in Charles's room. Margaret's poison was working, turning David's grief and fear into weapons against our relationship. The breaking point came on the 6th day of Charles's hospitalization. I had managed to arrange coverage for my shift so I could spend the entire day at the hospital, hoping to finally have some uninterrupted time with David and show him the support I desperately wanted to provide. Instead, I arrived to find that Margaret had arranged for a steady stream of family friends and business associates to visit, effectively ensuring that there would be no opportunity for private conversations between David and me. Frustrated and feeling increasingly isolated, I decided to take a walk around the hospital to clear my head and plan my next move. It was during this walk that I witnessed something that would haunt me for weeks afterward and confirm my worst suspicions about Margaret's true nature. I was returning from the hospital cafeteria when I saw Margaret in the parking garage, engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with a man I didn't recognize. He was tall and thin, dressed in a maintenance worker's uniform, with the kind of forgettable face that would blend into any crowd. What struck me immediately was Margaret's body language. She was leaning in close, speaking in urgent whispers, and there was an intimacy to their interaction that seemed completely out of place for a casual conversation. Instinctively, I stepped behind a concrete pillar and watched as Margaret handed the man what appeared to be a thick envelope. He examined the contents briefly before slipping it into his jacket pocket. They spoke for a few more minutes, with Margaret doing most of the talking while the man nodded occasionally. As they prepared to part ways, I heard Margaret's voice carry across the empty parking level. "You understand how important timing is. It has to look completely natural, like an unfortunate accident. The family is already under tremendous stress, and another tragedy so soon would be devastating, but not entirely unexpected." The man mumbled something I couldn't make out, and Margaret's response chilled me to the bone. "Good. And remember, she's been working late shifts recently, walking to her car alone in the hospital parking garage. The lighting in Section C has been problematic for months. Perfect cover for a mugging gone wrong." The man nodded and walked away, without another word, leaving Margaret standing alone beside her silver Mercedes. I pressed myself against the pillar, hardly daring to breathe as she composed herself, smoothing down her hair and adjusting her purse before walking calmly back toward the hospital entrance. I remained frozen in place for several minutes after she disappeared, my mind racing to process what I had just witnessed. Margaret Whitfield had just paid someone to arrange my death, disguising it as a robbery in the hospital parking garage. The woman who had spent months trying to drive me away from her son with passive-aggressive manipulation and social sabotage had escalated to planning my murder. The full horror of my situation crashed over me in waves. This wasn't just about protecting David from an unsuitable wife. This was about a woman so consumed with control over her son's life that she was willing to kill to maintain it. Margaret didn't just want me gone, she wanted me dead, and she was smart enough to arrange it in a way that would generate sympathy rather than suspicion. I thought about Amy's warnings, about the accidents that had plagued David's previous girlfriends. How many other women had Margaret targeted over the years? How many had escaped with their lives? And how many might not have been so fortunate? My hands were shaking as I made my way back to the ICU waiting room, trying to appear normal while my mind raced through possible courses of action. I could go to the police, but with what evidence? I had no proof of the transaction I had witnessed, no recording of the conversation, and no way to identify the man Margaret had hired. Against Margaret Whitfield's sterling reputation and social connections, my accusations would sound like the desperate fantasies of a woman trying to cause trouble for her boyfriend's family. I could confront David, but his recent behavior suggested that he would likely dismiss my concerns as paranoid delusions brought on by stress.
Margaret had spent weeks systematically undermining my credibility with her son, positioning herself as the voice of reason while portraying me as increasingly unstable and demanding.
Even if David initially believed me, Margaret would undoubtedly convince him that grief and exhaustion had caused me to misinterpret an innocent conversation. The only option that made any sense was to gather evidence, to document Margaret's plans in a way that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. I needed proof that would be undeniable, even to someone as thoroughly manipulated as David had become. That evening, I went home and systematically prepared for what I knew would be the most dangerous period of my life. I updated my will, left sealed letters with my closest friend explaining everything I knew about Margaret's threats, and began carrying a small digital recorder with me everywhere I went. If Margaret was planning to have me killed, I was going to make sure there would be evidence pointing directly back to her if something happened to me. The next few days passed in a haze of hypervigilance and mounting terror. Every footstep in the parking garage made me jump, every unexpected sound in my apartment sent my heart racing, and every interaction with Margaret became an exercise in maintaining composure while sitting across from someone I now knew was actively planning my death. Margaret, for her part, seemed to be enjoying herself immensely. She was more animated than I had ever seen her, almost giddy with some private anticipation that made my skin crawl. She began making comments about how much Charles's recovery meant to the entire family, how important it was for everyone to focus on what really mattered, and how she hoped this crisis would help clarify everyone's priorities. "Life is so fragile," she mused, during one particularly chilling conversation in the hospital waiting room. "You never know when tragedy might strike, when someone you care about might disappear from your life forever. It really makes you appreciate the people who are truly meant to be part of your family." David nodded absently, still too emotionally drained to recognize the implied threat in his mother's words. But I heard it clearly, along with the satisfied smile that accompanied her observation about life's unpredictability. Charles's condition continued to improve steadily, and the doctors began talking about discharge planning and cardiac rehabilitation. The crisis that had dominated our lives for over a week was finally beginning to resolve, but I knew that Margaret's plans for me were just getting started. With Charles out of immediate danger, she would be free to turn her full attention back to the problem of her son's unsuitable girlfriend. I began varying my schedule and routes to make myself a harder target, but I knew that such precautions could only delay the inevitable. Margaret had resources, connections, and most importantly, she had time. She could afford to wait for the perfect opportunity, when my guard was down or when circumstances aligned to provide the ideal cover for an accident. The waiting was almost worse than an immediate attack would have been. Every day brought new anxiety, new reasons to look over my shoulder, new reminders that I was living on borrowed time until Margaret decided the moment was right. I found myself studying her face during family gatherings, looking for signs that the countdown to my death had begun, trying to read the timeline of my own destruction in her cold gray eyes. What I didn't realize was that Margaret was also studying me, watching for signs that I suspected her plans or had discovered her preparations. She was far too intelligent to underestimate a potential opponent, and my recent behavior changes had not gone unnoticed. I was trying to gather evidence against a woman who had spent decades perfecting the art of manipulation and control, and she was beginning to suspect that I might pose a more significant threat than she had initially calculated. The game of cat and mouse between us escalated rapidly, with each of us maneuvering for position while trying to maintain the pretense of normal family relationships. David remained oblivious to the deadly chess match being played out around him, too focused on his father's recovery and his own emotional exhaustion to recognize the signs of impending violence. But Margaret was getting impatient. Charles's improvement meant that the family crisis that had provided perfect cover for her manipulations was coming to an end. David would soon return to his normal routine, potentially giving him the emotional distance he needed to see through his mother's recent campaign of influence. If she was going to eliminate me and make it look like a tragic accident, she needed to act soon. The opportunity she had been waiting for presented itself 2 weeks after Charles's heart attack, when he was finally discharged from the hospital and allowed to return home for continued recovery. The family decided to host a small celebration dinner to mark his homecoming.
And despite my growing fears, I knew that refusing to attend would only fuel Margaret's narrative about my lack of commitment to David and his family. As I prepared for what I suspected might be my last family gathering, I made sure my digital recorder was fully charged and tested. If Margaret was planning to make her move soon, there was a chance she might reveal crucial details about her plans during the evening. At minimum, I hoped to capture some evidence of her threats and manipulation that I could use to convince David or the authorities that I was in genuine danger. I had no way of knowing that Margaret had planned the entire evening as an elaborate trap, or that she had already set in motion the events that would lead to my death within hours of arriving at the Whitfield estate. The woman who had spent months trying to drive me away with social humiliation and psychological warfare was finally ready to move to a more permanent solution. The recording I was about to make would save my life, but it would also destroy any remaining illusions I had about the family I had hoped to join. What I was about to hear would confirm my worst fears about Margaret Whitfield and force me to accept a truth that would change everything I thought I knew about love, family, and the lengths people will go to protect their version of both. The stage was set for a confrontation that would either end with my death or Margaret's exposure, and as I drove through the gates of the Whitfield estate that evening, I had no idea which outcome awaited me. The Whitfield estate felt different that evening, charged with an undercurrent of anticipation that made my skin crawl. Margaret had outdone herself with the preparations for Charles's homecoming celebration, transforming the dining room into something that resembled a scene from a magazine spread. Crystal gleamed under soft lighting, fresh flowers adorned every surface, and the table was set for 12 with the family's finest china. I arrived precisely on time, my digital recorder hidden in my purse and my nerves stretched to their breaking point. David greeted me at the door with a kiss that felt distant and distracted, his attention already pulled towards managing the evening's complex social dynamics. Margaret appeared moments later, resplendent in a deep burgundy dress that complemented her silver hair perfectly. "Sophia, how lovely that you could join us," she said, her voice carrying that familiar note of false warmth that had become her signature greeting. "I do hope you won't need to leave early for work tonight. Charles is so looking forward to having the entire family together." The emphasis on entire was deliberate, a reminder that my inclusion was temporary and conditional. I forced a smile and assured her that I had arranged coverage for my shift, trying not to think about how that decision might have just sealed my fate. Charles looked remarkably well for someone who had suffered a major heart attack just 2 weeks earlier. Color had returned to his cheeks, and while he moved more carefully than before, his spirits seemed genuinely high. He embraced me warmly when I approached his chair, whispering his thanks for all the support I had provided during his hospitalization. "Margaret tells me you were practically living at that hospital," he said with a fond smile. "David's lucky to have someone who cares so deeply about family." Margaret's expression tightened almost imperceptibly at her husband's words, but she quickly recovered and began directing everyone toward their assigned seats. I found myself positioned at the far end of the table, strategically isolated from both David and Charles, while Margaret held court at the opposite end with perfect sightlines to monitor every interaction. The dinner conversation flowed around topics of Charles's recovery, upcoming family obligations, and business matters that would need attention as he gradually returned to his normal activities.
Margaret dominated the discussion with practiced ease, weaving a narrative of family solidarity and shared responsibility that subtly reinforced her position as the indispensable center of the Whitfield universe. As the evening progressed, I began to notice small details that heightened my sense of unease. Several of the other guests were people I had never met before, introduced vaguely as family friends, but somehow lacking the warmth and familiarity I would have expected from close relationships. They seemed more like an audience than genuine participants, their conversations stilted, and their attention focused more on observing than engaging. Margaret excused herself between the main course and dessert, claiming she needed to check on something in the kitchen. As she passed behind my chair, she paused just long enough to lean down and whisper, "I do hope you've been careful walking to your car lately, dear. The city can be so dangerous, especially for young women alone." The threat was delivered with such casual sweetness that anyone overhearing would have assumed it was merely concerned advice. But I heard the underlying message clearly, along with the satisfied smile in Margaret's voice that suggested my time was running out faster than I had anticipated. When Margaret returned from the kitchen, she seemed almost electric with suppressed excitement. Her cheeks were flushed, her movements more animated, and her voice carried a note of anticipation that made me increasingly nervous about what the rest of the evening might hold. "I thought we might adjourn to the library for coffee and brandy," she announced as the dessert plates were being cleared. "Charles, you should rest in your favorite chair while we catch up on all the family news." The library was Margaret's domain, filled with first edition books and family photographs that documented 4 generations of Whitfield achievements. Charles settled into his leather armchair with obvious relief, while the other guests dispersed into small conversation groups around the room. Margaret positioned herself near the fireplace, accepting congratulations on the evening's success and basking in the admiration of her carefully selected audience. I found myself gravitating toward the far corner of the room, partially hidden behind a tall bookshelf that provided some psychological distance from Margaret's constant surveillance. It was from this vantage point that I began to overhear fragments of conversations that confirmed my worst fears about the evening's true purpose. Margaret was speaking in low tones with a woman I recognized as Eleanor Ashworth, one of her closest friends from the country club circuit. Their conversation seemed innocent enough on the surface, focused on upcoming charity events and social obligations, but there was an undercurrent of excitement in Margaret's voice that made me pay closer attention. "Everything is falling into place beautifully," Margaret was saying, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes you have to be patient and wait for exactly the right moment, but when it comes, you must be prepared to act decisively." Eleanor nodded with the kind of knowing smile that suggested she was privy to information beyond what was being discussed openly. "And you're certain about the timing?" "Absolutely certain," Margaret replied. "Within the next hour, I would estimate. The arrangements have been made, the opportunity will present itself naturally, and by morning, this entire unpleasant situation will be resolved permanently." My blood turned to ice as the implications of their conversation sank in. Margaret wasn't just planning my death anymore, she had scheduled it for tonight, as part of this elaborate celebration that was really a farewell party disguised as a homecoming. The other guests, the careful seating arrangements, the timing of everything, it was all choreographed to provide Margaret with the perfect alibi when my body was discovered. I fumbled for my digital recorder, my hands shaking as I tried to position it to capture their continuing conversation. Margaret had moved slightly closer to Eleanor, and their voices had dropped even lower, but I could still make out fragments of their discussion. "The beauty of it is the tragic irony," Margaret was explaining with obvious satisfaction. "A young nurse, dedicated to saving lives, becomes the victim of random violence in a hospital parking garage. David will be devastated, of course, but he'll have his family to help him through the grief. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is remove obstacles that prevent someone from seeing clearly." Eleanor murmured something about David's emotional resilience, and Margaret's laugh was cold and calculating. "Oh, he'll recover. He always does. I've guided him through these disappointments before, and he emerges stronger and wiser each time. This will simply be the final lesson he needs about choosing appropriate companions." The casual way she discussed my impending murder, as if it were just another social problem requiring her particular brand of management, made me physically sick. But I forced myself to keep listening, knowing that every word she spoke was potentially crucial evidence. "What about the investigation?" Eleanor asked. "These things can sometimes become complicated." "Not this time," Margaret replied with supreme confidence. "I've made certain that everything will point toward a robbery gone wrong. A nurse working late shifts, walking alone in a poorly lit parking area, carrying the kind of valuables that would attract criminal attention. It's unfortunately common in that part of the city. The police will find exactly what they expect to find, and the case will be closed within weeks." My recorder was capturing every word, but I realized that getting this evidence to the authorities would be meaningless if I didn't survive the evening. Margaret had clearly put considerable planning into ensuring that I would be dead before anyone could act on any suspicions about her involvement. I began to edge toward the library's French doors that opened onto the terrace, thinking that I could slip outside and call for help.
But as I moved, I caught sight of Margaret watching me in the reflection of one of the room's many mirrors. Her eyes met mine in the glass, and her smile was predatory. "Sophia, dear," she called out, her voice carrying across the room with practiced social grace. "Would you mind helping me fetch something from the wine cellar? I want to open a particularly special bottle to conclude our celebration." The request was phrased politely, but there was steel underneath that made it clear this wasn't really a choice. Several other guests turned to look at me expectantly, and I realized that declining would create exactly the kind of scene that Margaret could use to paint me as difficult or unstable. "Of course," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady as I slipped the recorder back into my purse. "I'd be happy to help." Margaret's smile widened, and I caught a glimpse of genuine pleasure in her eyes. She had been maneuvering me toward this moment all evening, and now I was walking directly into whatever trap she had prepared. The wine cellar was located in the basement of the estate, accessible through a narrow staircase that led down from the kitchen. Margaret led the way with confident steps, chatting pleasantly about the history of the house and the previous generations of Whitfields who had built the impressive collection of vintage wines that lined the stone walls. "Charles's grandfather was quite the connoisseur," she explained as we descended into the cool, dimly lit space.
He traveled throughout Europe in the 1920s, acquiring bottles that are now worth more than most people's homes. I thought tonight deserved something truly exceptional. The cellar was larger than I had expected, with multiple rooms carved into the bedrock beneath the house. Margaret moved purposefully toward the deepest section, where the oldest and most valuable bottles were stored in temperature-controlled racks. The lighting was sparse, leaving pools of shadow between the few bare bulbs that illuminated the narrow pathways. "The bottle I'm looking for should be right back here," Margaret said, gesturing toward a section that was particularly dark and isolated. "I'm afraid I'll need your help reaching it. These old bones aren't quite as flexible as they used to be." As I moved past her toward the indicated rack, I heard the soft click of the cellar door closing and the unmistakable sound of a lock turning. My heart began racing as I spun around to find Margaret standing between me and the only exit, her expression having shed all pretense of social pleasantness. "I do hope you'll forgive the deception," she said, her voice now carrying the cold authority I had glimpsed during our previous confrontations. "But I thought it was time we had a private conversation about your future, or rather, your lack of one." I backed away from her, my mind racing through possible escape routes in the confined space. The cellar had no windows, no other doors, and Margaret was blocking the staircase that led back to the main house. "I know what you're planning," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the terror coursing through me. "I know about the man you hired, about the parking garage, about everything." Margaret's eyebrows rose with what appeared to be genuine surprise. "How remarkably perceptive of you. I hadn't given you credit for that level of awareness. It does complicate things slightly, but not enough to change the fundamental outcome." She began moving closer to me, and I noticed for the first time that she was carrying something in her right hand, a small object that gleamed dully in the poor lighting. As she stepped into a pool of light cast by one of the overhead bulbs, I realized it was a syringe. "The beauty of my original plan was its simplicity," Margaret continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone explaining a particularly clever solution to a complex problem. "A random crime in a dangerous area with no connection to our family whatsoever. But since you've demonstrated such unfortunate curiosity about my methods, I've had to develop a more immediate alternative." My back hit the stone wall of the cellar, and I realized I had run out of room to retreat. Margaret was now close enough that I could see the contents of the syringe, a clear liquid that I suspected was something that would stop my heart quickly and relatively quietly. "What you're holding will be a massive overdose of insulin," Margaret explained with clinical detachment. "Tragic, but not entirely surprising for someone under tremendous stress who might have made a desperate decision to end her suffering. David will be devastated, of course, but he'll eventually understand that you were simply too fragile to handle the pressures of our lifestyle."
She raised the syringe, and I knew I had only seconds before she would inject the lethal dose. In desperation, I lunged to my left, trying to get around her and reach the stairs. But Margaret was quicker than her age suggested, and she caught my arm with surprising strength. Now, she said, her grip tightening as she tried to position the syringe against my neck. Let's not make this more difficult than necessary. Think of it as a final gift to David, freeing him from a relationship that was only going to cause him pain in the long run. I fought back with everything I had, clawing at her face and trying to break free from her grasp. But Margaret had the advantage of position and leverage, and I could feel the needle getting closer to my skin. In a moment of pure desperation, I remembered the digital recorder in my purse and realized that even if I couldn't escape, I might be able to leave evidence that would expose Margaret's crimes. "Why are you doing this?" I gasped, hoping to keep her talking while I tried to reach my purse. "David loves me. Why can't you just let him be happy?" Margaret's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Love? Is that what you call this pathetic infatuation? David doesn't know what love is. He's been spoiled by too many women who were willing to settle for scraps of his attention. He needs someone who understands his true worth, someone who can guide him toward his proper destiny." "You mean someone who will let you control his entire life," I managed to say, as I continued struggling against her grip. "I prefer to think of it as providing necessary guidance," Margaret replied. "David has always been too trusting, too willing to believe that people's intentions are as pure as his own. Without my protection, he would have been destroyed by gold diggers and social climbers years ago." I finally managed to get my hand into my purse and activate the recorder, praying that it would capture Margaret's confession even if I didn't survive to deliver it to the authorities. "Like Amy?" I asked. "And Jennifer? How many women have you killed to keep David under your control?" Margaret's eyes flashed with anger at the mention of David's former girlfriends. "Those women were smart enough to leave when they realized what they were up against. You're the first one foolish enough to require more permanent persuasion." "So you admit it," I said, hoping the recorder was picking up every word. "You've been terrorizing and murdering women to control your son's love life?" "I've been protecting my son from relationships that would have destroyed him," Margaret corrected with icy precision. "And I've been remarkably successful at it, if I do say so myself. David has remained focused on his career and his family obligations, instead of being distracted by unsuitable romantic entanglements."
She adjusted her grip on the syringe, and I realized that our struggle was about to reach its conclusion. But as she raised her hand to deliver the fatal injection, the cellar door suddenly burst open, and David's voice echoed down the stairs. "Mother? Sophia? What's going on down there?" Margaret's expression shifted instantly from murderous determination to concerned confusion. "David, darling, Sophia became dizzy, and I was trying to help her sit down. I think she may have had too much wine." But David's eyes were already taking in the scene. His mother holding a syringe, me pressed against the wall with obvious signs of a struggle, and the locked door that suggested this hadn't been a casual trip to select wine. "What is that in your hand?" David asked, his voice carrying a note of dawning horror. Margaret glanced down at the syringe as if she had forgotten she was holding it, then looked back at her son with the kind of manipulative innocence she had perfected over decades of controlling his perceptions. "It's nothing, dear. Sophia was feeling faint, and I thought she might be diabetic. I keep insulin on hand for emergencies. You know how careful I am about medical situations." But David was already moving down the stairs, and I could see in his face that the pieces were finally falling into place. The locked door, my obvious terror, his mother's prepared explanation, it was all adding up to a picture he could no longer deny. "Sophia, are you hurt?" he asked, moving to put himself between Margaret and me. "Your mother was trying to kill me," I said, my voice shaking with adrenaline and relief. "She's been planning it for weeks. She hired someone to murder me in the hospital parking garage, and when that didn't work, she decided to do it herself." Margaret's mask of concern slipped completely, revealing the cold calculation underneath. "David, you can't possibly believe such a ridiculous accusation. Sophia has been under tremendous stress lately, and I'm afraid it's affected her judgment. She's clearly having some kind of breakdown."
But David was staring at the syringe in his mother's hand, and I could see the horrible truth dawning in his eyes. "Mother, why do you have insulin? Neither you nor father are diabetic." "I told you, it's for emergencies," Margaret replied, but her voice lacked its usual authority. "Emergencies like murdering your son's girlfriend?" David asked, his voice filled with a mixture of horror and betrayal. Margaret's composure finally cracked completely. "She was going to ruin your life," she snapped. "She was common and grasping and completely wrong for you. I did what I've always done. I protected you from making a terrible mistake." "By committing murder?" David's voice was barely above a whisper. "By removing obstacles to your happiness and success," Margaret corrected. "I've guided you through every important decision of your life, and I wasn't about to let some little nobody destroy everything we've built together." The confession was complete, captured on my recorder, and witnessed by the one person whose opinion mattered most to Margaret. David looked at his mother with an expression of complete devastation, as if he were seeing her clearly for the first time in his 32 years of life. "All those other women," he said slowly, "Amy, Jennifer, the others, what did you do to them?" Margaret's laugh was bitter and defiant. "What I had to do, what any mother would do to protect her child from predators and fortune hunters." David pulled out his phone and began dialing 911, his hands shaking as he realized the full scope of his mother's crimes. Margaret watched him with a mixture of fury and disbelief, as if she couldn't understand how her careful manipulation had finally failed. "David, you can't be serious," she said. "I'm your mother. Everything I've done has been for your benefit." "Everything you've done has been about control," David replied, his voice gaining strength. "You've terrorized and murdered innocent women because you couldn't bear to share my affection with anyone else." The police arrived within minutes, summoned by David's call and guided to the cellar by several worried guests who had noticed our prolonged absence. Margaret was arrested while still holding the syringe that would have ended my life, and my digital recorder provided crucial evidence of her confessions to multiple crimes. The investigation that followed revealed the full extent of Margaret's campaign of terror against the women in David's life. Amy's suspicions about the rental car were confirmed, and evidence was found linking Margaret to the harassment and intimidation of at least 4 other women over the years. The man she had hired to arrange my accident was identified and arrested, providing testimony that implicated Margaret in conspiracy to commit murder. David was devastated by the revelations about his mother, but he was also finally free to see our relationship clearly without Margaret's constant manipulation. The trial that followed was a media sensation, with Margaret's carefully constructed image as a pillar of society crumbling as detail after detail of her crimes came to light. She was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, her legacy forever defined not by her charitable works or social standing, but by her willingness to commit murder to maintain control over her adult son's life. The Whitfield family name, so carefully protected for generations, became synonymous with manipulation, obsession, and ultimately justice. David and I were married 6 months after Margaret's conviction, in a small ceremony attended only by close friends and the family members who hadn't been complicit in Margaret's schemes. Charles, who had been horrified to learn about his wife's crimes, walked me down the aisle and welcomed me into what remained of his family with genuine warmth. The recording that saved my life also saved other potential victims, as Margaret's conviction served as a warning to other controlling parents about the legal consequences of taking manipulation too far. David and I were married 6 months after Margaret's conviction, in a small ceremony attended only by close friends and the family members who hadn't been complicit in Margaret's schemes. Charles, who had been horrified to learn about his wife's crimes, walked me down the aisle and welcomed me into what remained of his family with genuine warmth. The recording that saved my life also saved other potential victims, as Margaret's conviction served as a warning to other controlling parents about the legal consequences of taking manipulation too far.
My experience became a cautionary tale about the dangers of toxic family dynamics and the importance of recognizing when love becomes obsession. Looking back, I realized that Margaret's downfall was ultimately caused by the same obsessive need for control that had driven her to commit her crimes in the first place.
She was so convinced of her own superiority and so accustomed to manipulating situations to her advantage that she never considered the possibility that her carefully laid plans might be exposed by the very technology she had dismissed as beyond her understanding. The digital recorder that captured her confessions was a simple device, available to anyone with $20 and a basic understanding of electronics. But to Margaret, who had spent decades relying on psychological manipulation and social pressure to achieve her goals, it represented a form of evidence gathering that was outside her experience and therefore outside her planning. In the end, justice prevailed, not because of any elaborate investigation or brilliant detective work, but because a desperate woman fighting for her life had the presence of mind to document the threats against her. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against evil is simply the truth, recorded and preserved for everyone to hear. The aftermath of Margaret Whitfield's arrest sent shockwaves through the social circles she had dominated for decades. The revelation that one of the city's most respected philanthropists was actually a calculating murderer who had terrorized multiple women destroyed not just her own reputation, but cast suspicion on the entire network of wealthy families who had enabled her behavior through their silence and complicity. In the days following her conviction, I found myself at the center of a media storm that I was completely unprepared to handle. Reporters camped outside my apartment building, eager for exclusive interviews with the woman who had brought down Margaret Whitfield. Television producers called constantly, offering substantial sums for my story, while book publishers competed to secure rights to what they were already calling the most shocking true crime story of the decade. The attention was overwhelming and intrusive, but it also served an important purpose. Other women began coming forward with their own stories about Margaret's harassment and intimidation tactics, creating a clearer picture of just how extensive her campaign of terror had been over the years. Some had been David's former girlfriends, but others were women who had simply crossed Margaret in business or social situations and found themselves subjected to mysterious accidents and unexplained misfortunes. Sarah Mitchell, a real estate agent who had represented a property that Margaret wanted to purchase below market value, described a systematic campaign of harassment that had nearly destroyed her career. Anonymous complaints were filed against her with the state licensing board, her clients received calls suggesting she was dishonest and unreliable, and her car was vandalized repeatedly until she was forced to relocate her business to another state. Catherine Ross, who had been nominated for the same charitable board position that Margaret coveted, experienced a series of accidents that seemed designed to undermine her credibility and influence. Important documents disappeared from her office, her home security system was mysteriously disabled during a break-in that resulted in nothing being stolen but her personal files being thoroughly searched, and rumors began circulating about financial irregularities in her previous charitable work that were later proven to be completely fabricated. The pattern was always the same. Margaret would identify a woman who posed some threat to her interests or control, then systematically work to eliminate that threat through psychological warfare, social manipulation, and, when necessary, more direct forms of intimidation. She was remarkably skilled at making her actions appear coincidental or justified, leaving her victims with no recourse and no way to prove that their misfortunes were anything other than bad luck. What made Margaret's crimes particularly insidious was her ability to leverage her social position and reputation to discredit anyone who might challenge her. She served on the boards of multiple charitable organizations, hosted fundraising events for local politicians, and maintained friendships with judges, prosecutors, and police officials who would have been responsible for investigating any complaints against her. When women tried to report her harassment, they were often dismissed as vindictive or mentally unstable, their credibility undermined by Margaret's careful cultivation of her public image. David struggled tremendously with the revelation of his mother's true nature. The woman he had loved and respected his entire life was revealed to be a monster who had systematically destroyed the happiness of everyone who had tried to build a relationship with him. The guilt he felt was overwhelming, not just for failing to protect me and the others, but for being complicit in Margaret's schemes through his willful blindness to her manipulative behavior. "I keep thinking about all the signs I missed," he told me during one of our long conversations in the weeks following Margaret's arrest. "The way she always found fault with every woman I dated, how she managed to drive them all away.
The convenient timing of problems that would arise whenever I was getting serious about someone. I convinced myself that she was just being protective, that her concerns were legitimate. I enabled her by refusing to see what was really happening. David's relationship with his father, Charles, became strained as more details about Margaret's crimes came to light. Charles insisted that he had been completely unaware of his wife's activities, but David questioned how someone could live with Margaret for 40 years without noticing her manipulative and controlling tendencies. The family was torn apart, not just by Margaret's actions, but by the questions her behavior raised about everyone who had been close to her. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and emotionally draining for everyone involved. Margaret's defense team tried to portray her as a devoted mother who had simply gone too far in trying to protect her son from unsuitable relationships. They painted me as an opportunistic gold digger who had manipulated David and orchestrated the entire situation to gain access to the Whitfield fortune. The strategy might have worked with a different defendant, but Margaret's own arrogance ultimately destroyed any sympathy the jury might have felt for her. When she took the stand in her own defense, she couldn't resist lecturing the court about the importance of maintaining proper social standards and protecting family legacies from the corrupting influence of people from lower social classes. Her testimony revealed the depth of her contempt for anyone she considered beneath her station, and her complete lack of remorse for the pain she had caused made it impossible for even her own lawyers to present her in a sympathetic light. I regret that my efforts to guide my son toward appropriate relationships were misunderstood, she said during cross-examination, her voice dripping with the same condescension I had endured for months. But I will never apologize for trying to protect my family's reputation and ensure that David married someone worthy of the Whitfield name. When the prosecutor asked her directly if she regretted planning my murder, Margaret's response chilled everyone in the courtroom. "I regret that it became necessary," she said with clinical detachment, "but sometimes extreme measures are required to prevent greater damage to innocent parties. If that young woman had succeeded in marrying my son, the consequences for our family would have been catastrophic." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all charges. Margaret showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, maintaining the same regal composure she had displayed throughout the trial. Even as she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, she seemed to believe that her actions were justified and that history would vindicate her dedication to protecting her family's interests. The conviction brought a sense of closure, but it also marked the beginning of a new phase in my relationship with David and his family. We had to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect, free from Margaret's toxic influence, but scarred by the trauma of what we had endured together. David began therapy to address the psychological damage caused by years of manipulation and control, while I worked through my own trauma with the help of a counselor who specialized in helping victims of stalking and domestic violence. Charles Whitfield made genuine efforts to welcome me into what remained of his family, but the shadow of Margaret's crimes made every interaction complicated and emotionally fraught. He was haunted by questions about how much he had known or suspected about his wife's behavior, and he struggled with guilt about his failure to protect the women she had targeted. The grand estate that had been the setting for so many traumatic encounters became a source of painful memories that none of us could fully escape. David and I decided to sell the estate and use the proceeds to establish a foundation dedicated to helping victims of domestic violence and stalking. The Margaret Whitfield Foundation for Victim Services became our way of transforming something negative into a force for positive change, providing resources and support for women who found themselves trapped in situations similar to what I had experienced. The foundation's work brought me into contact with dozens of other women who had survived similar ordeals, and their stories helped me understand that Margaret's behavior was part of a larger pattern of abuse that occurs far more frequently than most people realize. Controlling parents, obsessive ex-partners, and manipulative family members use many of the same tactics that Margaret had employed: psychological isolation, financial pressure, and when those methods fail, threats of physical violence. One of the most important lessons I learned was the crucial role that documentation plays in exposing this type of abuse. The digital recording that saved my life became a model for the evidence-gathering strategies we taught other victims through the Foundation's educational programs. We provided training on how to safely document threatening behavior, how to preserve evidence that could be used in legal proceedings, and how to build support networks that could provide protection when official channels failed. The technology that had been Margaret's downfall became a powerful tool for helping other women protect themselves from similar predators. Smartphones with recording capabilities, security cameras, GPS tracking devices, and other readily available technologies gave victims the ability to gather evidence and call for help in ways that would have been impossible just a generation earlier. Margaret herself became a case study in criminal psychology, with researchers analyzing her methods and motivations to better understand how intelligent, socially connected individuals can commit serious crimes while maintaining public reputation. Her ability to compartmentalize her criminal behavior while functioning effectively in other areas of her life made her particularly dangerous, but also
Elizabeth Warren, a forensic psychologist who interviewed Margaret extensively during her incarceration, described her as a textbook example of narcissistic personality disorder, combined with an unusual degree of strategic thinking and social manipulation skills. According to Dr. Warren's analysis, Margaret genuinely believed that her actions were justified and necessary, viewing herself as a protector of family values rather than a criminal who had terrorized innocent women. She showed no empathy for her victims and no understanding of why her behavior was wrong, Dr. Warren explained in her published research about the case. In her mind, these women were threats to something more important than individual rights or personal freedom. They were threats to the natural order of society as she understood it. Her crimes were not crimes of passion or desperation, but calculated acts designed to preserve what she saw as proper social hierarchy. The psychological profile that emerged from Dr. Warren's research helped law enforcement agencies develop better methods for identifying and investigating similar cases. Margaret's crimes had gone undetected for so long, partly because investigators weren't trained to recognize the sophisticated manipulation tactics employed by highly intelligent female perpetrators. The case became required study material for detectives specializing in domestic violence and stalking cases. David and I were married 18 months after Margaret's conviction, in a ceremony that was deliberately small and private. We wanted to focus on our commitment to each other and our shared future, rather than on the drama and trauma that had brought us together. Charles walked me down the aisle, fulfilling the role that my own father would have played if he had lived to see the day. The wedding was held in a small church far from the social circles that had been contaminated by Margaret's influence, attended only by close friends and family members who had supported us through the worst periods of our ordeal. It was a celebration of love and survival, marking not just the beginning of our marriage, but our emergence from the shadow of Margaret's control. Our honeymoon was spent in a remote cabin in the mountains, where we could finally be alone together without the constant fear and surveillance that had defined our relationship for so long. It was the first time in years that David had been completely free from his mother's influence, and watching him discover who he was without her manipulation was both beautiful and heartbreaking. "I feel like I'm meeting myself for the first time," he told me as we sat together watching the sunset from our cabin's porch. "I've spent my entire adult life making decisions based on what I thought she wanted or what would avoid her disapproval. I don't even know what I actually like or want for myself." The process of rebuilding our relationship and creating a healthy marriage required extensive therapy and constant communication. We had to learn how to trust each other completely, how to recognize and address the lingering effects of Margaret's manipulation, and how to build new patterns of interaction that weren't influenced by fear or survival instincts. One of the most difficult challenges was learning to handle conflict in our relationship. During the period when Margaret was actively trying to destroy us, every disagreement or moment of tension felt like a potential weapon she could use against us. We had become so focused on presenting a united front against her that we had never learned how to have healthy disagreements or work through normal relationship problems. Therapy helped us understand that conflict is a normal and necessary part of any healthy relationship, and that we didn't need to be perfect or completely harmonious to prove that our love was genuine. We learned communication skills that allowed us to express our needs and concerns without triggering the defensive responses we had developed during our time under attack. The Foundation's work expanded rapidly as more people became aware of the resources we provided and the unique perspective we could offer to victims of sophisticated psychological abuse.
We partnered with law enforcement agencies to provide training on evidence collection and case building, with mental health professionals to develop treatment protocols for trauma recovery, and with legal advocacy groups to push for stronger laws protecting victims of stalking and harassment. One of our most important initiatives was the development of a mobile app that allowed victims to safely document threatening behavior and automatically upload evidence to secure servers that could be accessed by law enforcement if something happened to the victim. The app included panic button functionality that could immediately alert emergency contacts and law enforcement, GPS tracking that could help locate victims in dangerous situations, and encrypted communication features that allowed victims to safely reach out for help. The technology was inspired directly by my own experience with Margaret, recognizing that traditional approaches to documenting abuse often put victims at greater risk by requiring them to maintain physical evidence that could be discovered by their abusers. Our digital approach allowed evidence to be preserved safely off-site while giving victims the tools they needed to build strong legal cases. Margaret's conviction had broader implications for the wealthy social circles she had inhabited for so long. The revelation that someone of her standing could commit such serious crimes forced other prominent families to examine their own behavior and the behavior of their associates more critically. Several other cases of harassment and intimidation came to light as a result of increased scrutiny, leading to additional arrests and convictions. The scandal also prompted changes in how charitable organizations and social institutions conducted background checks and oversight of their leadership. Margaret's ability to use her positions on various boards and committees to gather information about potential victims and to intimidate anyone who might challenge her had been crucial to her success as a predator. New policies were implemented to prevent similar abuse of institutional power. 3 years after Margaret's conviction, David and I welcomed our first child, a daughter we named Hope. The choice of name was deliberate, representing our belief that love and justice could triumph over even the most sophisticated forms of evil. Margaret would never meet her granddaughter, would never have the opportunity to influence or manipulate another generation of our family. Raising our daughter while carrying the knowledge of what Margaret had done to protect her version of family legacy was both challenging and empowering. We were determined to raise Hope with the emotional intelligence and critical thinking skills that would make her resistant to manipulation, while also teaching her the importance of standing up for herself and others when faced with injustice. The foundation continued to grow and evolve, eventually expanding beyond domestic violence and stalking to address other forms of psychological abuse and coercive control. We partnered with international organizations working on similar issues, sharing our technology and expertise with victims around the world who faced threats from sophisticated abusers. Margaret herself remained in prison, reportedly maintaining her belief that her actions had been justified and necessary. According to corrections officers and the few visitors she was allowed, she showed no signs of remorse or psychological change, continuing to view herself as a victim of an ungrateful society that had failed to appreciate her efforts to maintain proper social standards. Her case became a textbook example of how privilege and social status could be used to facilitate and conceal serious crimes, demonstrating the importance of believing victims even when their accusations seemed improbable or their accuser seemed respectable. The recording that had saved my life became required listening in criminal justice courses, illustrating the power of evidence and the importance of thorough investigation regardless of a suspect's social standing. Looking back on everything that happened, I often think about how different my life might have been if I had never met Margaret Whitfield, or if I had been intimidated into leaving David's life before her campaign of terror escalated to attempted murder. But I also recognize that our experience, as traumatic as it was, gave us the opportunity to create something meaningful from something horrible. The foundation has now helped thousands of victims document abuse, escape dangerous situations, and rebuild their lives after trauma. The technologies we developed have been adopted by law enforcement agencies around the world, and the legal precedents established by Margaret's case have strengthened protections for other potential victims. David and I built a marriage based on mutual respect, honest communication, and shared commitment to using our experience to help others. We learned that love alone isn't enough to sustain a relationship under extreme pressure, but that love combined with courage, honesty, and determination can overcome even the most sophisticated forms of evil. Margaret Whitfield taught us that evil can wear a respectable face, that danger can come from unexpected sources, and that the most destructive people are often those who believe their actions are justified by higher purposes. But we also learned that truth has its own power, that evidence can overcome reputation, and that ordinary people have more strength than they realize when they're fighting for something they believe in. The digital recorder that captured Margaret's confession cost less than $50, but it saved my life and exposed crimes that might otherwise have remained hidden forever. Sometimes the most important battles are won not through elaborate strategies or superior resources, but through simple tools and the courage to use them when everything is on the line. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.